In most American newsrooms, when Africa appears on the screen, it is usually the same. A quick shot of a crisis, a disaster, or an election nobody quite understands. But picture this instead. A woman in Conakry, in West Africa, stands in a crowded street market holding a scratched mid-range smartphone. She taps once, approves a payment, and a few seconds later, a dairy truck miles away is already packing an order in her name. No cash, no lines, no paperwork. Now zoom out. The dots on the map begin to glow. Lagos, Kigali, Johannesburg, Accra, Nairobi. One by one, streams of data start linking them, not randomly, but as if someone is quietly welding 54 different systems into a single humming network. For most of your life, you have watched Africa through the lens of dependency. Aid, loans, missions. Programs designed somewhere else. But something far less dramatic and far more important is happening in the background. The continent is trying to wire itself into one digital whole. Not just one trade area on paper, but one online marketplace, one shared identity layer, one set of rules for data, money, and movement. If that actually works, the question is not whether Africa will change. The question is much larger. What happens to the global balance of power when a continent of 1.4 billion people stops acting like a scattered set of small markets and starts behaving online like one digital country? To see how real this is, we need to go back to 3 days in a city most American viewers have never said out loud, Conakry, the capital of Guinea. It is the kind of place cable news cameras rarely visit unless something has gone terribly wrong. But in 2025, Conakry hosted a gathering that looked less like a political summit and more like an engineering workshop with motorcades. For 3 days, presidents, ministers, central bank officials, startup founders, and network engineers squeezed into meeting rooms under the banner of the Transform Africa Summit. It was the 7th time this gathering had happened. The difference this time was not the size, but the location and the mood. Conakry is in Francophone West Africa, a region that for decades was more famous for coups and commodity exports than cloud computing. Holding the continent's flagship digital summit here was a signal. This is no longer an East Africa experiment or a pet project of a few shiny capitals. This is continental business. On the main stage, the language was surprisingly precise. There were mentions of fiber routes, identity standards, cybersecurity protocols, and payment switches. But underneath the technical details, one sentence kept returning, in different accents and different languages, as if it were a chorus. By 2030, Africa will function as a single digital market. Not we hope to. Not we are exploring. A deadline. Behind that line is an alliance called Smart Africa, now counting more than 40 member states. 10 years ago, it was largely a club for policy papers and declarations. Now, when a country signs up, it receives blueprints, templates, and timelines. These are instructions for building things. National digital ID systems that can talk to one another, data protection laws that fit together instead of clash, payment rails that connect banks and mobile wallets across borders. In Conakry, you did not hear the usual conference slogans about innovation and empowerment thrown around casually. You saw slide decks with integration phases, Gantt charts stretching to 2030, and maps showing how identity systems in Benin, Ghana, and Rwanda will recognize the same person with the same digital key. You heard, maybe for the first time, a continental project being described not as an aspiration, but as construction in progress. For someone watching from Washington, Atlanta, or Detroit, it might be tempting to shrug and say, I've heard this before. Africa has had plans for decades. And that is true. There have been strategies, frameworks, and visions. But here is the quiet shift hiding under the PowerPoints. This time, the question people were asking in those rooms was not, why is digital important? That part is settled. The question, voiced over and over again, was simpler and sharper. What is left to align and how fast can we do it? And that naturally leads to something you almost never hear about on the evening news. Where did this new sense of alignment come from? And why is it happening now, after so many years of scattered attempts? For most of the last 2 decades, Africa's digital story has sounded like a series of separate headlines. Kenya built a world-famous mobile money system. Rwanda reinvented how citizens access government services online. Nigeria poured talent into startups that caught the attention of Silicon Valley investors. South Africa developed cyber laws, data centers, and a serious fintech sector. Each of these stories was impressive in its own right, but they moved like different rivers, full of energy but flowing in different directions. If you were sitting in Nairobi, you might not feel the impact of a clever policy in Accra. A new app in Lagos might never reach a user in Maputo. The continent was full of pilots but short on shared foundations. Smart Africa's real achievement has not been launching one flashy project. It has been slowly turning those separate rivers toward a shared ocean. Instead of leaving each government to write its own technical rules from scratch, the alliance has been quietly producing continental blueprints for digital identity, for health data, for cloud infrastructure, for cybersecurity. They are not inspirational brochures. They are detailed, sometimes boring documents that say, in essence, here is a way to build your system so it will plug into your neighbor's system later. Beneath the jargon is a deeper, more sensitive issue: data and control. For years, a large share of African internet traffic has taken a long detour. A message sent from one African city to another might travel all the way to Europe or North America and back again, because the data centers, the content, and the major exchange points were outside the continent. That arrangement worked, until governments began to ask what would happen in a crisis if their critical information were stored under someone else's laws. When you are responsible for pensions, hospitals, tax systems, and identity records, the idea that most of your digital life lives in another jurisdiction begins to feel less like convenience and more like a vulnerability. That is why, in recent years, you see ministers talking less about apps and more about where the servers sit, who runs them, and which laws apply to the racks of machines humming in dark rooms. Data sovereignty is no longer a slogan, it is becoming policy. In West and Central Africa, regional bodies have adopted rules that push sensitive government and financial data to be hosted inside the region. National strategies in countries like South Africa now treat local cloud and data centers as strategic infrastructure, side by side with ports and power plants. International finance institutions have started putting serious money into African data center companies, not as charity, but as investments they expect to pay off. Put simply, alignment is happening on three levels at once. Politically, countries are agreeing to move in the same general direction. Legally, they are copying and adapting the same set of rules instead of inventing 40 different ones. Technically, they are standardizing the way systems talk to each other, how an ID is issued, how a payment is cleared, how a medical record is formatted. All of that sounds good on a panel in Conakry, but if you are watching from your living room, you might reasonably ask a more down-to-earth question. What does any of this actually do for an ordinary African trying to make it through the day? If you strip away the acronyms and strategy documents, the promise of a single digital market comes down to something very simple: less friction, less wasted time, less repeating the same task in slightly different ways because a borderline on a map breaks the logic of the system. For decades, most Africans have not lacked hustle, ambition, or ideas. What they have lacked is a smooth surface to move on. They run into friction everywhere. A business that works well in one country suddenly hits a wall next door. A mobile wallet that pays for groceries in one city is useless just across the river. Opening a bank account, registering a company, applying for a license, each step requires more lines, more stamps, more waiting. To understand what a single digital market might change, imagine one person. Mariama, 42 years old, a nurse in a government hospital in Conakry. Her days are already long. She moves from bed to bed, checking on patients with pneumonia, malaria, complications from diabetes. But every shift, she loses hours to paperwork. Test results printed on paper, files stored in crowded cabinets, forms that have to be carried by hand across the campus. More than once, she has watched a critical lab result arrive too late. Now imagine that the blueprints discussed in those hotel conference rooms are actually implemented. The hospital where Mariama works becomes part of a national health information system. Records are digital, updated in real time, securely linked to a digital identity that travels with the patient. A man who falls ill in a village clinic hundreds of miles away arrives at her ward, and his history follows him automatically. When she orders a test, the result is uploaded the moment it is ready. She still works hard, but the system finally works with her instead of against her. That is one small piece. Another plays out in the marketplace. A mechanic in Lusaka sells spare parts across town, paid in cash. He would like to ship to customers in Harare, but cross-border payments are a maze of fees, delays, and paperwork. Under a true single digital market, his phone number could act as a wallet usable from Zambia to Zimbabwe to South Africa. The buyer in another country sees his inventory online, pays in their local currency, and both of them let the system handle the conversions and settlement in the background. For small entrepreneurs, this is not a futuristic dream. Regional payment platforms are already being built to let banks, mobile money providers, and fintechs settle cross-border transactions in local currencies instead of routing everything through the dollar or the euro. For the neighborhood shop owner, it simply feels like cheaper, faster payments and a larger customer base. Then there is access to government services. Today, whether you are in Africa or America, you probably have your own stories about standing in line for a permit or license. In much of Africa, those lines are longer, the buildings hotter, and the forms more confusing. Countries like Rwanda have shown that a citizen can request dozens of services, from birth certificates to land titles, through a unified online portal. In a single digital market, there is no reason that kind of platform could not be shared, adapted, and integrated across borders. A citizen in Guinea could benefit from software refined in Rwanda without waiting for their own bureaucracy to reinvent the wheel. The visible changes are practical. Fewer trips to the city center, fewer days lost to queues, more chances to start and grow a business that crosses old borders. The invisible change is psychological. When systems finally work, people plan differently. They are more willing to register a business, to declare income, to invest in long-term projects because the environment is not constantly punishing them for trying. But as life inside the continent becomes a little less tangled, something else begins to shift outside of it. When Africa reduces the friction between its own countries, the rest of the world starts watching more closely. And that raises a new, uncomfortable question. In a world where everything from passports to pensions is turning into data, who actually holds the power to switch Africa's digital future on or off? To answer that, we have to look at something that does not make headlines, but quietly decides what is possible, where the continent's digital soul actually lives. For years, a surprising amount of African internet traffic has left the continent before coming back. A message sent from one West African country to another might loop through data centers in Europe. Streaming a local video often meant talking to servers thousands of miles away. This was not a conspiracy. It was the result of history and infrastructure. The data centers, the large content hubs, the global cloud platforms were built elsewhere, in places that industrialized earlier and invested billions of dollars into digital plumbing. Africa, with its young population and late arrival to the internet, simply plugged into what already existed. But when African leaders started considering what would happen in a crisis, a sanctions dispute, a geopolitical standoff, even a technical failure, it became clear that this reliance carries serious risks. If your digital ID system, your tax records, or your hospital databases depend on servers controlled by foreign laws and foreign companies, how much sovereignty do you really have in an emergency? That question keeps resurfacing in cabinet meetings and parliamentary hearings. It is part of the reason regional blocs are passing rules that require crucial public data to be stored locally or at least within the region. It is why finance institutions are backing local data center firms with large investments. It is why you now see cloud and data policy described as critical national infrastructure. Still, the numbers are sobering. Despite all the construction and investment, Africa still holds only a small fraction of the world's data center capacity, far below its share of the global population. Much of its digital content lives off the continent, and the main undersea cables and exchange points that carry its traffic are owned and managed by a small number of players. So the cliff's edge looks like this. Africa is in the middle of building a single digital market where one ID can unlock services across borders, where one phone number can send money to neighbors thousands of miles away, where government files and health records flow quickly and securely. But if the servers, the switches, and the platforms that make all of this possible site under someone else's jurisdiction, then the continent is essentially constructing a beautiful digital house on land it does not fully own. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that a legal dispute in another country, or a sanctions regime decided in a distant capital, has slowed or cut off access to the systems your hospitals rely on, your pension checks depend on, your courts use to manage cases. It sounds extreme until you remember how many times in recent years ordinary people around the world have discovered that a single company's outage or a single political decision could disrupt lives far beyond the original conflict. So the uncomfortable question hangs in the air. If Africa's future is digital, who really holds the switch? The governments signing the strategies? The young engineers writing the code? Or the handful of corporations and jurisdictions that still host much of the continent's data? The answer, or at least the beginning of one, lies in a set of moves that most viewers never hear about. Quietly, African governments and regional institutions are trying to pull more of that switch back into their own hands. On the policy side, several regions have started requiring that sensitive categories of data, financial records, health information, core government databases, be hosted within their own borders or at least within the African continent. This does not mean cutting off the rest of the world. It means insisting that the backbone of public life is anchored at home, under local law, even if it connects globally. Countries with stronger economies and more developed tech sectors are rolling out their own national cloud policies, making it explicit that critical government services must eventually run on infrastructure inside the country. That, in turn, creates demand for serious local data centers, not just server rooms in ministries, but purpose-built facilities that can host banks, hospitals, tax authorities, and startups. International investors have noticed. Development finance arms of global institutions are putting tens of millions of dollars into African data center companies, betting that as more governments and businesses move online, they will refuse to keep shipping their data overseas. Payment giants are building processing centers on the continent, reducing the distance that transactions must travel and aligning more of their operations with African regulations. At the regional level, Smart Africa is playing the role of chief architect. By offering shared blueprints for everything from digital ID to health systems, it gives countries a way to harmonize their choices from the start. Instead of launching 50 separate experiments, governments can adapt a common design, knowing that it will interlock with their neighbors' systems later. Smart Africa's training programs then walk civil servants, regulators, and engineers through these designs so they can actually implement them. The payoff of all this is leverage. Once IDs, payment systems, and data standards begin to align, Africa's relationship with global tech firms shifts. A company that wants to offer a continent-wide platform cannot simply pick one or two countries with weak regulations and use them as a backdoor to everyone else. If the rules match across borders, the company has to negotiate with a bloc, not a fragment. The continent becomes less of a hunting ground for piecemeal deals and more of a partner with bargaining power. Of course, not everyone is convinced. Critics outside Africa point to persistent problems: power shortages, uneven internet access, corruption, political instability. They argue that grand plans for cloud sovereignty and digital integration will collapse under the weight of these familiar challenges. It is easy from a comfortable distance to imagine that Africa being Africa will hold back any serious transformation. The reality is more complicated. Yes, the challenges are real. But even in difficult environments, mobile networks have spread, smartphone adoption has climbed, and broadband coverage has expanded at double-digit rates. In country after country, simple improvements in connectivity have been linked with tangible boosts in productivity and income. The idea of skipping some of the detours that older industrial powers took is not naive optimism. It is already happening in pockets when policy and infrastructure line up. Inside Africa, skepticism sounds a little different. Some citizens worry that talk of a single digital market is just another elite project, something officials in capital cities brag about while rural communities still struggle with basic needs. They ask reasonably whether cross-border payment systems and cloud regulations will do anything for a farmer without electricity or a teacher in a school without computers. The honest answer is that digital reforms will not fix every problem, and they will not reach everyone at once. But they can change the trajectory for millions of people and businesses who already have a phone in their pocket and just need the rules to stop getting in their way. Consider a second character. Kwame, 55 years old, runs a small woodworking shop on the outskirts of Accra. He has spent his entire adult life crafting furniture, tables, chairs, wardrobes. Most of his sales come from within a few miles. When buyers from a neighboring country ask about his work, the conversation usually dies when they realize how complicated it is to move money and goods across borders. Different currencies, unpredictable fees, unclear taxes, too much trouble for a small order. As regional payment platforms and digital trade tools mature, that equation changes. A store owner in Abidjan can scroll through a marketplace app, find Kwame's work, and place an order in their own currency. On the back end, the systems convert and clear the payment, complying with regional rules but shielding both sides from the old complexity. Logistics companies plug into the same infrastructure, offering cross-border delivery services that used to be reserved for large corporations. For Kwame, there is nothing magical about it. He simply ships more tables to more places and finally feels that the rest of the continent is not a distant idea but a reachable market. That is what the single digital market is supposed to do at its best. Not impress foreign observers with glossy brochures, but quietly expand the space in which ordinary Africans can move, trade, learn, and heal. So where does this leave the larger story, the one you rarely hear on the nightly news? It leaves Africa at a crossroads where its internal digital order and the external global system are starting to collide in interesting ways. Inside the continent, as IDs, payments, and data become more integrated, governments will behave differently. When one country develops a smart, balanced way to regulate artificial intelligence, others can adopt and adapt it instead of starting from scratch. When a strong cybersecurity framework proves effective in one region, it can become a model for others. Over time, the patchwork of policies begins to look more like a library of tried and tested solutions than a collection of improvisations. For the young Africans learning to code, manage networks, or design cloud architectures, this matters too. They are no longer training just for a job in their city or their nation. They are stepping into a labor market that, if these plans work, will stretch from Lagos to Kigali to Casablanca to Cape Town. Their skills become portable across borders, not because passports have changed, but because the underlying systems recognize and value the same digital qualifications. Globally, the implications are even more striking. For much of the last century, Africa has been treated as a place where technologies built elsewhere are deployed. Systems were imported, often on terms set by donors and foreign firms. If Africa succeeds in knitting together its digital backbone and anchoring more of it on home soil, that picture changes. The continent becomes not only a buyer of technology, but a maker of rules about how that technology can be used, especially when it comes to data, privacy, and cross-border flows. That shift does not announce itself with fireworks. It shows up in trade negotiations where African blocs insist on clauses about data localization or algorithmic transparency. It appears in global forums where African delegates argue not as petitioners, but as architects of emerging norms. It is felt in boardrooms where multinational executives realize that entering Africa now means complying with coherent, continent-wide standards, not exploiting gaps between 50 different regulatory islands. From your vantage point, perhaps in a country that built much of the early internet infrastructure and later watched it morph into something darker and more invasive than many expected, there is something familiar in this story. You have seen what happens when digital progress races ahead without enough thought about data, power, and accountability. You have watched social media redefine public life, seen data breaches expose millions, and lived through debates over surveillance, privacy, and control. Africa's leaders and technologists have been watching too. Many of them are trying, in their own imperfect way, to avoid replaying the same film. They cannot escape every mistake. No one can. But they do have one advantage. They are wiring their societies in a world where the costs of getting the digital architecture wrong are already visible. The next few years will determine how far this continental experiment goes. It could stall, strangled by politics, underfunded, trapped in the gap between vision and capacity. Or it could mature into something that forces the rest of the world to adjust, a coherent, confident African digital space negotiating with others on its own terms. And that brings us back to the question we asked at the beginning. What happens to global power when one of the youngest, fastest-growing regions on Earth stops being a scattered set of emerging markets and starts to function online as a single, organized digital giant? If that moment comes, it may not look dramatic from the outside. There will be no single day when a news anchor in New York declares, "Africa has arrived." Instead, there will be small signs. Investors treating the continent as one large, complex but understandable space. Tech firms redesigning their products around African standards. Young professionals thinking continent first, not country first. Whether you see that as a threat, an opportunity, or simply an overdue correction may depend on where you sit. But if you care about freedom, sovereignty, and the right of people to design their own future, the idea of an Africa that bows to no one, digitally, economically, and politically, should at least give you pause. If this story has made you think differently about a part of the world you have mostly seen in 30-second clips, consider staying with us. There are more layers to peel back. The role of China and the United States in this new digital chessboard, the struggle inside African countries to balance security and privacy, the battles over who profits from the data generated by 1 billion and more lives lived online. If you want to follow that journey, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Because in the quiet work of fiber cables, data centers, and digital IDs, a new chapter of the 21st century is being written. And Africa, after a long time on the margins, is picking up the pen for itself. Africa bows to no one.